So as I talked about, today we're going to talk about news gathering practices, and this will really be done in two parts. Today we're going to talk about, the overview of how we find stories, how we gather information. And then on Wednesday, we're going to be talking about interview and sourcing. And I'm going to tell you about something fun that we're going to do on Wednesday to prepare you for it. But that's kind of an overview of where we're going this week. But one of the main things that we need to think about in terms of story ideas is connecting these ideas to news values. And the news values are pretty standard across industries. So whether you're working in print, digital, social, even entertainment, has these same kind of values, right? And so any type of media content production that you're doing, you really need to know these news values as an important aspect of looking for ideas. So who can describe the impact news value? Who has an example of an impact news value?
Would it have been like what we talked about earlier about like receiving assistance or in a major event, even like a storm, see like the aftermath and the stories people have to tell?
Yes. So impact can it can describe the impact of an event on the community at large. So, for instance, a storm coming through, a damage assessment would show that there was impact on the community. But it's really talking about the degree to which or how much something is impacting the lives of your readers or viewership. So the higher the impact, the more value it holds, right? So if we have a single car crash in which there are no injuries, what's our level of news value there? How many people does that affect? Not very many, right? What if there's a single car crash with no injuries, but that car went through the home of an elderly couple and the car stopped just inches from the foot of their bed? Impact's a little bit higher, right? Because now we have this other couple involved. They now have damage, to their home. It also has a little bit of like an oddity novelty news value there. And so impact really talks about, the degree is building, right? Now, what if there's a 15 car pileup on the interstate that keeps traffic back for hours and hours? Impact rises because more and more people are affected. So that's the idea behind the impact news value. What about timeliness? What's an example of a timeliness news value?
Um, if like a storm is happening, I guess people would need to know that type of information in a timely manner.
Yes, exactly. So this is a news value that is tied to time, chronology, breaking news. For instance, something that's just happened is really important. Something that happened today, something that's even happening tomorrow that we want them to know about, that they would need to know. So, for example, like a voting registration deadline would be a timeliness news value because that's something that is not only important and helpful for people to know, but it's tied to a piece of time. And so a lot of times we have breaking news coverage that if it had happened at like 3 o'clock, or if it happened at like noon, no one would care about it. But because it happened at 5 o'clock during the newscast, like shots were fired, police are on the scene, then it becomes breaking just because of the time that it happened. So it's a little, we need to evaluate the timeliness news value in conjunction with these other news values, because if it's just a shooting that happened somewhere, we don't know of injuries, we don't really know what's happening, then perhaps it being timely isn't enough, right? But certainly storm and weather coverage, it relies on a huge timeliness news value. So good job with that example, Victoria. What about proximity?
Isn't proximity like location, like if it's like close to you?
Yes. So proximity just means the physical location, how close something is to you. So here we could use an example of the number of cases at Montevallo. right? The further away you are from the University of Montevallo, the less value that information holds. But if you're a student at Montevallo, you're going to want to know the number of positive cases on campus because that affects you because you're proximal to it or close to it. Where I highly doubt that New York is considering our Montevallo case numbers very important, unless something crazy happens, and we pray that doesn't happen. So yes, absolutely, proximity equals how far or close you are to the story. What about prominence?
Prominence is, I guess it's like, is it prominent to like what's going on right now?
So yes, in a sense that prominence is about what's important right now. But prominence has an important characteristic. It's actually tied to a person as opposed to a thing. So what is prominent?
Is that like relatableness, like to the different person?
That one's more tied to helpfulness or impact, I think. When we're talking about prominence, we're really talking about someone who has fame or notoriety. So why do we report every movement of the president? Is it particularly newsworthy? Not always, but the president is a position of high prominence, right? Would we normally care if a 70 or 80-year-old woman received a vaccine? Probably not. That wouldn't make the news. But what if that woman is Governor Kay Ivey? That makes it a news value because she is a prominent figure of our government. In the same way that this is why celebrity news tends to be news value, right? Or hold news value because they are prominent figures within culture and society, often, sadly. Oddity and novelty is that like news of the bizarre. It's just the news that will capture the audience's attention. So like lasso snakes, like we learned about last weekend, is only newsworthy because it's weird. Conflict is any time that you have two or more opposing viewpoints. So this is why a lot of political news is newsworthy, partly because it impacts your life, but also because there's usually an element of conflict to it that makes it important. Human interest are those pieces that bring the human element of the story to us. So this is a lot of feature stories, especially anecdotal or narrative, rely on human interest, that these are things that we find interesting because we can relate to them as human beings. Why do we care that a teacher knitted mittens and then Bernie Sanders wore them to the inauguration? Because it's interesting, it's something that we find cool. So that's what human interest is. And then helpfulness are those like tips or life skills that our readers need to know how to do. Like how to register to vote, how to do mail-in voting, for instance, would be helpful information for your reader or audience to know. So we mainly know all the types of news, but there are some important like vocabulary terms that we need to be clear on. So hard news is the important like detail-based, facts-based information. It is your crime news, your politics, things that are happening in a very timely manner. Just the facts, ma'am, from Dragnet. Where feature news tend to be longer, in-depth stories that detail the background and impact of events and the people that are affected by it. So it's the difference between Jonathan saying, we just got this federal money to do help with mortgage payments or payments for rent versus here's how the money is being spent, or here's how it's being allocated. Here's someone affected by it. So that is hard news because it's just the facts, where the other is an in-depth feature reporting because it provides different information to our viewers. Soft news is different than feature news. Sometimes you'll hear these terms be used interchangeably, and they're really not, because is all feature news soft? Not really. In the example that we just talked about, where we would go and investigate the allocation process of federal funding, that's hard news. That's, it's not soft, but it's feature because it's more in depth, it's investigative, right? And so soft news is that news that is entertainment in nature and has no urgency. Reaction or plan stories are those that you know are going to happen. And you know that they're going to happen because you have either been given a press release that they are going to happen, or they're a scheduled event. The reporter shows up and the story is already there for them. Okay. An enterprise story is the story that you create, that it's not based on a press release or any kind of timed event. You're investigating, you're creating your own story. So the investigation of allocation of funds, for instance, would be an enterprise story because you are creating the details and the facts of that story. They're not just being handed to you, right? Where if there was a press conference to show the let's say they're like giving a big check or something. The federal government doesn't do this. Let's pretend like a donation was made from an organization to help people pay their mortgages. And we have that like check ceremony where, you cannot cash an actual check like that. It's just for presentation, right? If we were going to that and reporting reaction from that event, that's a planned event. Does that make sense? The difference between those two? And then evergreen stories are those that can run at any period of time. Let's say breaking news happens and your story has to get pushed. It will still make sense tomorrow, or it will still make sense later on in the day because it's not tied to any timeliness news value. It's more based on just regular life. And so it's not tied to any specific timed event. Make sense? So you would not want to do a reaction to college night changes in May, right? Because there is an event that's timed and you have a time peg. So that is not an evergreen story. You would want it to be tied to the timed event that's going on. But an evergreen story might be looking at the history of college night, right? That can run at any time. Now it'd be great if it ran near college night, but we could talk about that anytime and it would still be fresh. Any questions with that before we move on? Okay, those are basically reviews, but I know that those terms can be used interchangeably, so I want to be clear. So how do we come up with story ideas? This is usually the largest complaint that I hear from young journalists is, I never know what to write about. I don't know where to find stories. And to you, I say lies, because you guys do mapping every single day in class with your newscast huddles, right? You take a broad concept. Like today we talked about the death of baseball legend Hank Aaron. And then we define the audience. So who is the audience for us? What are some characteristics of our audience?
We have a college audience currently.
We have a college audience. What state do we live in? We have an Alabama-based audience. The age of our students skews younger. We have good diversity. And so we have a broad mix of racial demographics. So those are all things we can consider. So what did we tie the death of Hank Aaron to within defining our audience? In our newsroom huddle this morning.
Oh, what we tied to it?
Mm-hmm.
I think Danielle talked about like the impact on the African American community in Mobile or the whole state. So yeah.
So we talked about an Alabama community since he is from Mobile. So we defined our audience by the state. And then we refined our audience even further by talking about, athletes who are part of a minority community who would have been affected by his civil rights impact. So by doing that, we can take this broader concept and define our audience, and that can give us story ideas. We talked about Larry King passing, for instance. Well, that gives us a time peg, right? Because we have an event that occurred. And so now we can time peg off of that, which would be a reaction-based story, which we talked about earlier today as well. We could also take a broad concept like COVID-19, and we could sit here and brainstorm for probably 5 minutes only and come up with 30 different topics of COVID-19, right? Mainly because that's all we talk about nowadays. But I mean, let's do it. Let's do it for 1 minute. What topics could you write about off COVID-19? Everybody come off mute. Let's just shout them.
The effect
how
of
the
Deaths we've had.
Vaccine.
Economy,
Mhm.
vaccine,
Cool.
deaths,
the effect on people.
effect on people. I assume you mean like emotionally.
Emotional.
But we could also talk about the effect on people in terms of physical health, the symptoms of COVID. We could talk about the effect on people in terms of financial. What about learning, right? How education systems have changed. What else? We're like 30
People's daily
seconds.
lives have changed.
The university, how lives have changed. And that, I mean, goodness, just off how lives have changed could be a million different things, right? All right, we got like 10 seconds. Let's go.
Social distancing
Stimulus
policies.
packages.
What'd you say, Jonathan?
Stimulus packages.
Stimulus. Okay. All right. And so that was 1 minute of brainstorming. We had economy, vaccine, deaths, emotional effect, physical effect, financial effect, education, university, live change, social distancing, and other policies. We have stimulus. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. You just had 11 stories in 1 minute. So you can see how these brainstorming of things really help us map out different coverage patterns. So you can come to me and tell me you don't have a story idea, but I'm pretty much going to tell you that you just need to map out some concepts, right? You also can use your news values. So go back to, these list of news values and think about, okay, what are the biggest impacts on our campus right now? Obviously, COVID's probably going to be a major one, right? But there are other ones. We've lost a revenue source from having a decrease in students or a decrease in certain types of students, right? So how does that then affect faculty pay? How does that affect scholarships, right? So we could think along those lines. I could say, okay, what's closest to me? Okay, maybe I'm Strong Hall, and then I can go further out. Okay, how is the campus at large being affected? Then I could go to Main Street, then I could go to Montevallo, right? And think about all the things going on in each of those areas. So you can use your news values as a way to brainstorm ideas. You should also just be curious as journalists. I think one of the natural characteristics that journalists need to have is a curiosity and a desire to know more. So take notice of trends and changes. A lot of times things that you guys think are just normal trends and changes are actually very newsworthy because you as young adults are trendsetters in a lot of different ways. Think about what are the new apps that are being used? What are some of the learning trends that you use that others may not have done in the past? What do you do that none of your friends do? Or what do your friends do that you've never heard of before? You want to think about things that are changing or trendy and be on the cusp of that. And that's actually a real benefit to you being a young journalist, as opposed to someone who's veteran and not exposed to those new trends and types of things. We also want to always look for ordinary people doing extraordinary things. When you hear someone tell a story about someone in our community who is doing this cool thing, it can turn out to be like the coolest story ever, right? So I'm in a Facebook group for the community, the neighborhood that I live in, and this little girl, every time I would like ride down the street, this little girl was doing her little lemonade stand. And I was like, oh, that's so cute. Like she's selling lemonade, right? Well, then I learned that one day I stopped and got some lemonade to, support young female entrepreneurs. And I was talking to her and I was like, so I've seen you out here like every day this week. Why are you doing this? And she was like, well, my little brother is at Children's and he has cancer. And so I want to raise money for Children's Cancer Center to like in honor of my brother. This girl was 6, y'all. And I was just like, oh, here, let me buy that whole gallon from you. Right. But that could be a story, right? That is a feature. That is a human interest story that tugs at your heart. And so by just noticing things on the side of the road, even as you're driving, that can be a really good way to generate stories. I will tell you the best darn story I ever did as a student journalist. If you have ever been to Tuscaloosa, I'm not sure if you have, if you drive into Tuscaloosa, there's this man who wears a cowboy hat outside of, it's not Jack's, what is it? Not Hardee's. I'm losing the name of Carl's Jr. No, that's wrong too. Anyway, he sits outside of this restaurant every day in full cowboy regalia and holds a sign that says, honk if you love Jesus. And he stands there for hours every morning on people's commutes. And it's amazing when you get into that intersection, how much noise there is because people are honking, they're waving. People will like ride up to him and stop and talk to him for hours. And I was commuting in from my apartment to campus every day, and I would see this. And finally, I just stopped and I started talking to him, and he was the most fascinating person ever. And I actually won an award for that piece. I won a national award for that piece. And it was just something that I noticed on the side of the road. Right? So you always need to be looking for something unusual, looking for ordinary people who are doing different things that hold those news values. You also want to investigate things. So don't take things at face value, start trying to dig deeper and look for the needs of your audience. So think about what you need as a student. What information could you gather that would help the rest of the student body, right? So meeting needs is very important. And one way that you can meet needs is through the hierarchy of influences. This gets us into like some communication studies, psychology theory here, but I think it's a really good way to think about the needs of people. You have the most basic of our needs are physiological needs. It's how we provide air, right? We can't live without air. We can't live many days without water or food, shelter, sleep, clothing. And when these things are threatened, they become very important for us to protect, because if we don't have these things, none of the things on top of them matter. So in pitching Jonathan's story about rent, right? Why is it important for us to have people have homes? It's because it's our most basic need to have shelter, right? So that makes it newsworthy on its face because it's talking about a need that we all have. Safety then is the second level of need, where we're wanting security, employment, resources, health, property. This is why COVID is so important, because it is threatening our safety need on so many levels, right? This is also why crime news tends to be pretty important, because whether we realize it or not, when we see stories about crime that happen in our community, it speaks to law and order being protected within our own communities. And so we feel better knowing that crimes are solved, or, that police are working on things. Or on the opposite end of that, when there is corruption in safety organizations, we need to know about that so that we can work to change those patterns and make us more safe. So those are why those stories are important. Then you have love and belonging, esteem, self-actualization. So these are ways that we can springboard ideas, but the needs of your audience are really important. The more basic the need, the more likely it is to affect and reach people. Does that make sense? So this is another tool in your toolbox you can use. So there are many forms of storytelling. that we can use as well. So once we've gathered our information and decided on our topic, then we need to know the various ways that we can present the information we gather. And I know I'm missing a step because I need a whole day to talk about interviews and data gathering. But once you get that step, then we're going to talk about how we present that information. You, of course, are going to write a story about it. And whether that's print or radio, TV, whatever format you're using, you can also use these tools. I'm going to go into each one in detail. So I'm going to flip the screen and all my note takers are going to freak out. It's okay. You'll see them all on an individual slide. So you can do a social only story. For instance, you can see Usain Bolt during the Olympics is talking about records, and he's live tweeting Olympic records, right? And so that's one way we could share information. And of course, none of my links are working because that would be too easy on a Monday. But then we could also do social only stories. So these are called social packs, and they are becoming very important in our industry. They do not have a reporter track on them. They rely on the graphics, these pieces of words on the bottom to tell the story. Sometimes they use interviews, like this one uses an interview with the woman who knit Bernie Sanders mittens, right? But they don't have to. Notice a lot of these images are also still. They're images that came from citizens or came from the people affected by them. So this teacher can send in a few photos. We can get a close-up of Bernie's mittens and things and make an entire package out of it. You don't have to be this wonderful MMJ multimedia journalist to create this content, but it's an alternative form of storytelling that we all need to consider using, especially because it gets us high engagement on social media platforms. We can also use slideshows, which are really great for digital analytics, because every time you click next on a slideshow, it counts as a new click on your website. And advertising rates increase the more clicks you get. So if you have a bunch of clicks, you are more likely to get more traffic on your website, be able to charge for ads more. So for instance, having just a random slideshow of fun Bernie memes. I could look at this all day. But anyway, so you can see that that is actually revenue generating for your website. It's also interesting content that, they have an entire digital article. They also have a package on here. And so a very simple story has a lot of different elements to it. And I really like that in their coverage. We can use graphics to tell information. So here's NBC News, how to plan your vote. Can I vote by mail without an excuse? And it gives you the symbols for each state. Yes, COVID-19 can be your excuse. No, and COVID-19 cannot be your excuse. So you can see it's pretty basic information. This isn't very hard to gather this data or this information, but it's also a really easy way for your viewers to get information visually. And again, every time I click these, this is a different click on that website, which increases your revenue. So graphics are really important because they tell information visually. Breakout boxes are typically used only in print or digital journalism. And so this is a term that we pretty much use exclusively for those two types. In print journalism, it means that you're offsetting a bit of data or a quote away from the rest of the article. So these can also be called pullouts. It's when you take some information and make it more prominent and typically more visual so that it stands out and becomes more important. So here, The Guardian has a bunch of data on Putin's trade deals. And then here we have a pullout quote to show the reader what is most important about what our interviewee has said. So those are other ways that we can present information. You can have Q&As. So here is an entire story that is about plus size modeling. So they have a slideshow here of her modeling, and then you can see that it's just a pretty basic feature Q&A. But these are actually really, really popular, especially on digital media. You can also have it where it's a little more incorporated, so you don't see that like basic Q&A format, but here you have an article up top. Notice all the great hyperlinks to a lot of additional resources that are given, but then you see the reporter's question and the respondent's answers, and these are done in paragraph format. So these are another great way that you can get more in-depth feature reporting. The only caveat with Q&As is that ethically speaking, if you ask a question, you need to include every single part of their answer. And so even if that person is rambling, even if that answer isn't fully like awesome, you're not going to want to edit like you do when you're picking out quotes. Does that make sense? That you need to include more of the interview in a Q&A than you would, even if that content isn't the quality that you would necessarily want it to be. You can also use polls as visual pullouts for your data. And so here you can see PBS has done a poll on what is the biggest threat to keeping our elections safe. They've created a basic pie chart, which you can do in Word or Excel pretty easily. And then they give you like the percentages here. What's the problem with this poll? What's the problem with data journalism in general? Yes, Danielle?
Oh, well, I was thinking with this one in particular, there's not a lot of like contrast in the colors. So I know that can be an issue for people who have like
visual impairments. Yeah. So that's a really good point, that when you're wanting to make something visually stimulating and stand out, to use contrast, because she's right. We have like 4 different shades of blue and they're all the top responses, and they kind of bleed together. So there's very little differentiation. That's actually not what I was gonna say, but that is very true, Danielle. What else do we have to be careful with data journalism? This is why journalists don't go into science, because how many people participated in this poll? It's hard to read, isn't it? That's the problem. They're not being very transparent about the number of people who participated in this. In fact, they're using a statistical measure, which is N. N is the total number within your sample. How many of you knew that? Did you know that N equals the total number of people who took the survey? No. And is 1,259 people enough to represent the beliefs of our nation? No, right? This is bad data journalism, NPR. Tisk tisk on you. Because here's the thing. This is not a scientific survey. A scientific survey involves very large samples that are representative of an overall population, and they talk about the standard deviations of responses. You can see here that these are within 3.5 percentage points of being accurate. That's a pretty large percentage point when we're talking about these differences, where voter suppression and foreign interference are within 1 percentage difference, right? So I get what they're doing. Goodness, they had a 5-day poll and only got 1,200 people, right? But they're not being very transparent about this data. And it's honestly meaningless when you think about what this data actually tells you. So just be very careful with data journalism and know that you're being scientific and transparent with what you're doing, right?
Well, also, I think it could cause a lot of damage with like some people may see 24% voter fraud, and then some people could be like, well, maybe since there's a large majority or a good bit thinking that there's voter fraud, maybe there is voter fraud. And as we've seen in the past, that's not true.
Right. And so again, we have to keep in mind that these are people's perceptions of threats, like the American public's perceptions of threats, rather than what the actual threats are. Where voter fraud actually happens extremely rarely in American elections, and usually there's actually never been a presidential election where enough voter fraud has been discovered to turn an election. I'm not saying that it's not a big deal. It is something that we need to address, but it's certainly not 24% of the safety of our elections, right? So keeping in mind what your data is actually telling you is really important. And that's also really good in terms of media literacy for us. When we see this, we don't need to be fooled by this, okay? But what would this tell you as a journalist? If you saw this poll, what would this tell you about story ideas that you might get? Right?
Maybe we need to investigate, since so many people think there's so much false news or misleading information. Maybe we need to get a hold of that and go to Facebook, Twitter, Parler, all that stuff, and see what's going on.
Right. So it would give you an idea of what the concerns of the public are, and therefore you could use that data in your investigations. So FAQs are those that take a topic and then you provide the frequently asked questions and get an expert to answer them for you. So since I ragged on NPR earlier, here's NPR's version of an FAQ that they're doing. And it's actually a really good series where they are asking frequently asked questions about COVID life, and then having an expert answer those questions. These in particular are about mask wearing and a particular kind of mask. So then they have an expert come and talk about what's the difference in this brand of mask versus other masks, and it provides some good information. So there are also charts that you can use. I'm sure you've seen 1,010 different versions of this chart, but here is the local one from WVTM. And I can tell you, I know how they build their charts. They actually input their data on a day-to-day basis. So again, we have data tracking for journalism. There are some concerns that I have with how COVID numbers are shared through journalism, because would this graph ever decrease? This one right here, this COVID-19 cases total for Alabama? No. Why? It's cumulative. It's always going to increase, right? Because you are not getting rid of the cases that are solved. Now it does show, you know, the slope of the line, how quickly sometimes grow versus others. But most people don't have enough data literacy to understand why this isn't decreasing. And they go, oh my God, look at how many cases we have in Alabama right now. No, this isn't day-to-day numbers. This is the cumulative total from the beginning of March till now, right? And of course, we know that there are problems with the state reporting this data too. Do we have where this data is coming from in these graphs? That's not transparent, my old employer, right? But this is the more accurate day-to-day. But is that really explained? Are the differences between these two data sets really explained, or are they assuming that the reader knows? There are assumptions.
I think, yeah.
And assumptions make an ass of you and me. I just said ass in class, I apologize. Okay, so nope, that wasn't the right link. Oh, that's not the right link at all. I will find us the 360 AR and VR link and share that with you. Now, your textbook in the chapter you were supposed to read for today talks about the different types of features. They're so common to the types of leads and types of organizational systems that I'm not going to go into each one. Use your textbook to differentiate between these. And then that's going to be your homework today.